back. Welcome back to the Latino Vote podcast with the great Mike Madrid and my good friend Chuck Rocha. Chuck, you look, I can't say the word online, but you look effing amazing right now. I love the jacket. I was told by a little birdie that it might say something on the back. Can you show us?
Look, this job's about marketing and exposure. Y'all need to get your game up. Now, look, when I show up, let me preface this. When you show up at a conference, let's just say I'm at Naleo, Mike, and it's not good enough that you're the only Mexican there in a cowboy hat. So sometimes you need to be the only Mexican in a cowboy hat and a red blazer with your firm's name initialed on the back.
Wow.
Love it.
Solidarity Strategy strikes boldly on your jacket. It looks fantastic.
Thank you.
I want to get my logo on the back, but I don't have one yet. So maybe I'll get the Latino.
I think inside of some of these black T-shirts at the Gap now, they have the Mike Madrid black T-shirt. I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, we're going to start selling them on merchandise here on the Latino Vote podcast. You can get your black T-shirt to get that Mike Madrid look down.
You should do that. Plain black T-shirt.
That's it. It's the uniform. It's a Mike Madrid uniform.
That's great. Well, welcome back, listeners, to the Latino Vote. We're excited about what we're talking about these days. And from past episodes, we go deep on a lot of issues that I think are relevant to the Latino community. We don't often talk about what I'll call current events or events that are just generally in the political ether. But I wanted to address some issues today to discuss how they might impact Latinos' voting patterns and how Latinos might respond on some of these issues, just because we've all been watching the news. We all know what's happening in Europe right now. We're watching the Supreme Court justice nomination hearings, and we're seeing just issues pop up daily that are important. And so one of the things that I'm curious about, and we'll start with Mike today, is how these issues are impacting Latinos in their perspective of politics and their perspective of how they might vote. Will they have an impact? Or, as you mentioned on an episode recently, are Latinos just too engaged in their life, at working and taking care of their kids and going to school to really be overly impacted by some of these things? And let's start with the biggest global issue, what's happening in Ukraine. I mean, we all have been watching. We all are praying for the brave and courageous people of Ukraine as they take on the communist Russians and the Putin regime. But is that issue one that has saturated the media at all levels? Is that going to have an impact on how Latinos might perceive candidates or approach races coming forward? Or is that just more a general political background noise?
So it's a great question. And again, as a campaign professional, the way that I'm looking at this when I'm trying to communicate or understand or poll or test what voter attitudes are, regardless of the demographic, you've got to look at certain other, demographic subsets that Latinos happen to occupy. And Chuck has been, pointed this out numerous times. Latinos are decidedly younger. Right, where the average age of the Latino is about 27 years old. For the non-white Hispanic, it's about 36 years old. And that means that we are getting our information from different places. It also means that we are consuming a little bit less issues related to politics and international affairs. We're also a poorer demographic, which is also another sign that we are less engaged in the day-to-day type of activity that perhaps people at other economic levels are, right? Those are just kind of statistical facts. It doesn't have anything to do necessarily with being Latino. It has to be done. It's a function of being younger. Younger people are poorer than everybody else, if for those of us that remember being younger and poorer. So, but it's also important to understand that there is also a higher propensity for Hispanics, for Latinos, especially young men, to join the military and be involved in military service. A lot of the last names of the privates and the enlisted men in our armed services have names like Rocha, Villalba, Madrid. Our names are Hispanic surnames and increasingly will be as we continue as a younger demographic profile. Again, this is just math. So, and military experience is a big part of the politicization of Latinos. In fact, there are two key indicators of Latinos voting Republican. The first is military experience, military involvement, military engagement, and the other is evangelical Christianity. So I say this is just kind of the 30,000 foot level start on how to kind of approach an issue like Ukraine. But Latinos also have demonstrated at times of war a greater rally around the flag effect than non-Hispanics, which is interesting. We saw this in the 2004 re-election of George W. Bush against John Kerry. We were a country viewed, at least perceived by the public, very much at war in 2004. It was one of the few elections since 1998, may have been the only election since 1988, where a Republican actually won the national popular vote. Again, America was at war, and George W. got about 40% of the Hispanic vote nationally. Now, again, he was a Texan, and that helped because there's a lot of Latinos in Texas. I don't need to tell the both of you that. But that rally around the flag effect was a much bigger jump for Latinos than it was for non-Hispanics. My strong suspicion is it will probably still be prevalent with a sufficient Hispanic breakout. But takeaways here, don't want to sound too in the weeds about this from a demographic and number standpoint. Younger demographic, more likely to be engaged in military experience, higher bump on a rally around the flag effect. I think all of those speak probably well for Biden at this point in time. Got a long way to go between now and the November elections. But for the moment, I think that the Ukraine issue in particular probably breaks better amongst Latinos, Hispanics than it does for non-Hispanics.
Chuck, obviously I want to hear your thoughts on that one, but I'd love to get your input and thoughts around the hearings that we watched on television this week, right? So Ketanji Brown was put through the ringer primarily by Republicans who were essentially badgering her for 3 days. And it was impactful. I'm watching this. You know, I come from a family of strong women. My mother and grandmother, working professional women who had to deal with a lot of shit growing up. I'm raising 2 daughters. I'm married to a strong woman, and I'm watching people from my former political party, Republicans, just absolutely attempt to denigrate and destroy this woman who is very articulate and thoughtful and brilliant and eminently qualified. And I thought to myself, this can't be good politics at any level. Now, I know that Latinos are not a monolithic voting bloc, as we've talked about many times before on this program. But certainly, I think we are a matriarchal group of people. And I can't imagine that this is a good thing for someone like, I don't know, Ted Cruz in Texas or anybody else who might have embraced that kind of attack to KBJ.
You know, I'm glad you brought this up because I was watching and watching the reaction, and we should be clear. I mean, me and Mike have been really creating this podcast with you, Jason, to have a lot of straight talk with people, right? We really have been trying to shuck it back to the cob so you understand what is really the facts here. And the facts are most of Americans are not paying attention to this. The facts are that this singular issue that a Black woman got on the Supreme Court, whether you like it or not, and I love it, is not a big factor in getting people elected to Congress or the Senate, which is the goal of the midterms, with a big but and caveat. As Democrats, we've been sitting around thinking about how we're going to motivate people to the polls in the midterm elections. And we also know, and me and Mike have talked about this, is that Latinas, the women, they vote at such a higher rate for Democrats than men within the quote unquote Latino voter segment, right? So you already have women that are pulling their weight more than men when it comes, in my opinion, to electing Democrats. And as I'm sitting there watching that, thinking about my son, thinking about my multicultural grandsons, thinking about my beautiful Black fiance, who is a badass in her own right, with me nowhere around her. She's badass by herself, owns a company here in DC, is in the wellness sector. And I was thinking about the things that were said by Alex Padilla and the things that were said by Booker. And as they're talking and they're getting emotional, I'm making 30-second ads in my mind of what I would run on digital, targeting women of color, targeting folks to be like, there's an emotion behind this. It's kind of like in the last episode when Mike Madrid was very honest about immigration and about immigration policy. Well, there's more to immigration than just policy. There's more to a Supreme Court than just being on it. There's the emotion of the journey. And the emotion of the immigration story is what we miss in the policy many times, and just look at it by running to our corners. There's an emotional journey that Judge Brown made to get to where she's at. And I think that journey is what a lot of young Black women, a lot of brown women, a lot of multicultural women, and up until just a few years ago, many, many white women, let's be honest, have went through. And that story of that journey, of that woman in that workplace, that woman in that courtroom, being judged differently than the men, dealing with mainly male judges, is a story that's told every day in America, in a society that's still somewhat sexist, in a society that still judges people on the color of their skin. That's why I think it does make a difference if used in the right way to create a commonality with lots of women who have been bailing out the Democratic Party for a long time. Mike,
if you were advising Josh Hawley or Ted Cruz, and I know you'd never take them on as clients, but if you were advising them, look, they've been told, go after, be bold, because it'll get you on Hannity tonight. You'll get, 3 minutes of national television exposure. And if you're going to run for president, this is going to be a good thing. What would your advice be to them? Is that valuable enough to overcome what, in my mind, again, is watching it, I knew all the suburb soccer moms out there were just cringing at what they were watching. What's the calculus behind that? And is it just sheer abject ambition from those two candidates, or was there somebody advising them that this is a good idea?
Well, let me speak to the first question you asked, Chuck, first, then I promise I'll get to that, and I'll be quick here. I think if you watched Senator Alex Padilla's response to that, his setup question to the nominee, I think you got the perfect cutout for what you need to do to have the Latino voter engage with this issue. Is just his own talk about how he was the soft, bigotry of low expectations, as George W. Bush used to call it, is when Alex was trying to be dissuaded from going to MIT because his teacher didn't want him to be disappointed. That is really, I think, how you correlate the Latino experience to this really profound historical moment with an African-American woman about to rise to the highest court in the land. So with that, let me segue to kind of what Hawley and Ted Cruz are doing. And the answer is, yeah, they're playing continually to this smaller, ever shrinking base of voters, right? And they're competing with one another. This is about Hawley and Cruz in a primary. They're trying to occupy the Trump lane. And what they're going to do is they're going to do everything they can possibly do to embarrass themselves, to show who's the craziest, silliest, most ridiculous example of the Trump lane in this party. It's extraordinarily damaging to anybody outside of that lane, but that is the way that they're reading the tea leaves, probably correctly, through the Republican primary to get to the nomination in the event that Trump does not run or is unable to run. And that's all that this is about. This is all about presidential politics. It has nothing to do with expanding the base for either the party or the imagery for themselves personally with their own political ambitions. It's all focusing as much as they possibly can on this shrinking narrow lane of Fox News viewers. And that's really what Ben Sasse called him out on it, right? Republican senator basically, clowning Ted Cruz by saying, this is just performative. This is all about trying to get on camera on Fox News at this moment to start occupying that lane. That's all that it is. And it's unfortunate, but it's the reality of today's Republican Party.
And it's curious to me, really smart people like you and Chuck recognize that immediately. Less smart people like me and former candidates like me also kind of see, it's like, performative or not, that's not effective. I'm always curious as to what must be going through the minds of those who beclown themselves so publicly, I guess, to attract that sliver of the, I guess it's a primary electorate that they're looking for. And, is that where the Republican Party is? And as they go to that very, very tiny fraction of the electorate, where does that leave Latinos, right? Because I think very few Latinos are truly driven by sort of the QAnon, big lie, Trumpism. They're more interested in the issues that we talked about on our last episode, good jobs and education for the kids and insurance. How will this race to the tiny sliver of the primary electorate impact the way Latinos look at Republicans? Let me start with Chuck this time, because I'd love to get his insight if he's running in campaigns down in South Texas against these three Latinas who are running as essentially, Trump light down there. Is this a good strategy for them in a general? And I imagine I know your answer to that, but why?
Look, I'll go back to my original I think as much in emotional and all the things that these hearings are, the working class folks of McAllen aren't watching this. They may see a snippet of it on their evening news, but that's it. And they're not getting a newspaper anymore. They may scroll past something. And if they are following it, Mike Madrid would back me up here, they probably already have a party. They probably will not leave that corner. And that's just the basics of where we are. The real question that you have about, is this a smart strategy for the general in a place like Texas 15? And for those of you at home who may not have all the district memorized like we do, it's the old Vicente Gonzalez seat. It's been redistricted to be an R+2 seat. It used to be a D+10 that the Republicans made about an 8-point jump into, where Vicente barely won last time. And there's a runoff on the Democratic side. And in full disclosure, I'm working in a runoff for several outside organizations, as we could say. And there's an Army veteran school teacher, Ruben, running. There's a community activist, small business owner, Michelle, running. And they'll run against this woman who's Latina, who was a very much Trumper, who was backed by Trump, who's already got the endorsement of Trump. And so this will be a real testing ground on what's the real vision for this district. Again, for those of you listening, 78% Latino, is probably registered at over 68% Democratic, but you still see this performance, which doesn't make sense on paper, of how they overperform for Republicans when it gets to the general election. So let's just say that each one of the Democrats, all depending on who wins, will be a real test case. If Ruben wins, it's the classic Army veteran, school teacher, lawyer. Here's his wife. Here's his two beautiful sons. If it's Michelle, it's woman on woman. She's, a strong woman who's built her own business with her family. She's a community organizer. She aligns herself more left than Ruben. All depending on where you are on the political scale, that could be good for her or bad for her. That's why I'm saying keep your eye on this race, because no matter who wins, you're going to see if this Trumpism, and this is the most important thing I'll say about this, without Trump on the ticket, does it have an impact for this woman to just have his endorsement when folks don't have him on the ticket to go vote for? And so this is why I think this may be the test case of this race. If we lose this race, the Democrats, we're going to lose a lot of races throughout the country. I truly believe.
I want to get Mike's thoughts on this. I do believe that what's happening in the Rio Grande Valley is a microcosm for other states around the country, as it relates to the Trump effect. As you and I had discussed before, the Texas Hispanic Policy Foundation, the group that I run, looked deeply into these issues and what was driving some of that movement towards Republicans with Latinos down there. And like you pointed out astutely in your New York Times op-ed, it wasn't only Trump. Trump certainly had an impact. The cult of personality attracted the Hispanic males down there, but much less so females. But they were driven largely by economic issues, like the defund the police was a message that didn't resonate because they have a lot of law enforcement down there. And then the green energy movement was not popular because of the fact that lots of jobs are created in that industry and RGV. So fully embracing the Trumpism of that sort of entire milieu of issues, is that going to be a winning strategy? We don't know the answer to that yet. We're going to find out in November. Am I reading that right, or have I missed something?
I think you're reading it right, but I think there's a little bit of conflation of a couple things. So let me try and clarify it, at least from my perspective. There has been nobody in American, history, at least in the last 5 years of American history and during the Trump era, that has been able to accurately redeploy Trumpism and become a Trump candidate. The idea of Trump is he is so unique. That is what makes him Trump. It's that he is not like anybody else. That's the appeal. So all of these clowns that are just trying to act like him and be more Trumpy, that has never proven to work. In fact, Glenn Youngkin in Virginia was basically running against him in order to get the voters that he needed to win. So there are plenty of examples of people running against Trump in the Republican primaries that have been successful. There's very few, if any, that have demonstrated the proclivity to be like him, replicate him, and replicate that success. Okay, that's really important. One, and I think again, all of these theories will be tested, as Chuck pointed out. The second is when Trump is not on the ballot, turnout does fall with his constituencies. He has a unique ability to bring low propensity white rural voters to the polls in a way that no other Republican has been able to replicate. Okay, and so there's a turnout challenge, there's a message challenge. And I think where there was a little bit of conflation is, you also mentioned, Jason, some of the defund police and the critical race theory. Those aren't Trumpian as much as they are the excesses of the Democratic Party that the Republican is using to frame them as the more extreme group. And that's the danger. That's the flashing light. If this was purely about Trump and a referendum on Trump and Trumpism, I think Democrats would be in a much better position. I think you could be looking at a 2018 type of a year where Latinos did do something very unique in our 30-year history of looking at data, which is we had very high turnout numbers, showed up very strongly against Donald Trump when he was not on the ballot. That would be kind of a best case scenario. The danger of what is developing and what most of the polling data is showing right now, the DCCC's numbers are showing it, the public polling is showing it, is that there's this continuing leftward shift on all of these issues, whether it's the economic populist issues of blue-collar workers in the Rio Grande Valley, people who work with their hands for a living, whether it's the excesses of these cultural issues, which the Democratic Party is increasingly being defined by. And to me, that's the bigger issue. It's not necessarily Trump or Trumpism. I think Trump is actually a net negative in most instances, from both a turnout and messaging perspective. We have to remember these shifts began before Trump. In many ways, he accelerated some of those, but I believe that they're going to continue beyond him unless the Democratic Party makes some adjustments towards being more of a blue collar working class party.
Chuck, let's talk about the inverse of that question. I know that there is a schism within the Democratic Party about sort of the progressive movement that's a part of the Democratic Party, juxtaposed against sort of the old classic conservative, or I should say center left type Democrats that you see. There was a candidate, or not a candidate, but a congresswoman in Florida who recently said she's not going to run again because she feels like she has been ostracized by the party at large, who's moving towards a more progressive style of candidate. Now, I don't know enough about the internal politics of the Democrats to speak one way or the other to this. What is your thought on that, and how does that play out in places like Texas, where your candidates are Democrats, but they're pretty much centrists, all right? They're not progressives, and how does that play out?
I don't know if the titles really work today everywhere. Liberal, centrist, what are you, right? Like the press makes us want to choose a corner. I remind folks, I love to remind them of this, when they talk about how the Rio Grande Valley is becoming more Republican and it's going to be a Republican way. Well, boys and girls, in that same damn election, Bernie Sanders won every single one of those counties. Well, you may step back and grab your little notebook and say, yeah, but Chuck, but that was in the Democratic primary. Well, you dumb some bitch, that it's everybody down there is a Democrat. Everybody is. So it's not like they're doing something different and there's different voters. It's the same group of folks. But guess what? They probably, some of them, many of them voted for Bernie Sanders in the primary and turned right around and voted for Donald Trump. Now, I make that analogy to say that there's 435 different congressional races. My sister, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who I love like a sister, and I love everything about her. She represents her district well, and she gets elected in her district, and she beat an incumbent who'd been there for 20 years, right? Now, people say, well, AOC is an anomaly. Well, Miss Bush in Missouri, and folks, there's places where there's an electorate that is a little more in their issues centered around issues that these women, these progressives are serving up, that is very much in tune with their voters. And it's different everywhere. But I think the thing I like to talk about when folks are like, well, Chuck, you're a liberal, or Chuck, you're this, or you're that, you know, that there's certain thing that Democrats miss and that Republicans have picked up on, to my gist almost, because they don't, in my opinion, give a shit about workers. They care about donations and corporations. And the piece of that is the work, Jason. Is work binds us together. That dirty Republican, that dirty Democrat who goes to work in that tire mill or in that oil factory is getting the same dirt on them. And they have to go to work and they don't like that work, but they're doing it because they want to feed their families. They want their babies to go to college. They want to have enough money to maybe get a little bit on a deer lease, drink a little cold beer, hang out with their buddies. But the work, Jason, the work is what binds us together. And we've forgotten about that as Democrats. Damn, I hate when I agree with Madrid, but he's on to something when he talks about the working class, right? And how Democrats have to get back to that piece. I think that's at the core of this, because you can talk to the working class. I'm the only one on this program right now who ain't never been to college, and I'm the lefty Democrat. I understand working people issues, right? You can do that through a lens that says, worker, I care about you and I care about your well-being. I want you to have worker safety at work. I want you to have a way to make a living wage. I want your kids to be able to go to a community college for free. Like, there are ways to message that without saying we should turn this place into Cuba. I'm just, if you really just nail it down to that way we don't have to go to our corners and go away.
That's wisdom, folks. Replay all that over and over.
Yeah, straight fire right there. You know, when I was in the legislature, people would say, well, Villalba, you're a moderate. And they'd say to friends of mine who were maybe more conservative, so-and-so, you're a conservative. And, you know, I was friends with all those folks on both sides of the political aisle. And you pointed it out absolutely correctly. It's like, look, I represented my district, so we might not always agree, you know, among ourselves on the legislative floor, even in Congress. But look, you got to be where home is. And so I'm anxious to see how this plays out in places like the Rio Grande Valley and how it impacts Latinos, because I keep going back to Mike's piece in the New York Times. I just feel like, and correct me if I'm wrong, Mike, that Hispanics don't give a shit about the jersey that the candidates wear. I think what they care about is whether or not they're going to be able to, you know, make a good living wage and take care of their kids and have a good school. And that's what matters. And whoever's doing that, whichever candidate is talking about those issues that resonate the most, I think ends up winning in these races. Is that being too Pollyannish? Is that naive?
No, I mean, I think there's some truth to it. I mean, that doesn't mean that we are not, you know, as partisan as our non-Hispanic counterparts. But look, and Chuck said something that I want to, you know, dig into a little bit here too. My op-ed piece does not say that they're becoming Republicans, because they're not. These are Democrats. Back when we were all younger and I had hair and you know, Chuck was doing more honest work for a
Just
living.
stop wherever you're going with this. Stop, please, God, for God bid. Just go on with your point.
We used to call those Reagan Democrats. These were Democrats that were voting for Ronald Reagan. They were voting for Republicans, but they were dyed-in-the-wool Democrats. And the reason they were voting for Republicans was two reasons. They liked this economic populism that Reagan was talking about. There was these shades of America first, buy America. You heard this a lot. Don't buy those Japanese cars. Buy a Chrysler and a Ford, even though there's not as good of cars anymore because we stopped being competitive 10 years prior. But it's your patriotic duty to buy American. That's the first. And the second was Reagan talked about culture and American culture through a very conservative lens. And these Democrats, a lot of them union members, but overwhelmingly working men and women working with their hands, they responded to it. That did not mean for 30 years, from 1980 to the early 2000s, they did not shift their party registration. Okay, at least for 15 years until 1994, you did not see the sea change elections. That's what I'm talking about. So when you see these reports saying, yeah, well, Latinos still identify Democrats at the same number, that's because they are Democrats. Of course they are, but they're voting differently. Like, that's quantifiable. It's not a poll. You can actually see hard numbers. These districts are shifting in their vote patterns. Doesn't mean that they're not Democrats. It's what they're saying is, I'm a Democrat. I like the values of the Democratic Party, but damn it, give me something, party, to remind myself why I'm in the working man's party. And it's why the title of my piece, the original title, was "The Democratic Party Didn't Leave Me." The Latinos are leaving, or Latinos aren't leaving the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party left them, from the old Reagan quip. That the Latinos aren't changing. It's the Democratic Party shifting away from its working class roots. And if it gets back to it, it's going to be in a much stronger position with the fastest growing segment of the electorate.
Let's close today's episode on some quick hits. And I want both of you to answer this question. It's beginning to be the springtime. There's going to be a number of primaries around the country. We've already had a primary in Texas. We've got some runoffs coming, but I know in Georgia and other major states coming up, there are some important races. Chuck, let's start with you. What three races are you watching, not only as a person who's interested in politics, but as an indicator for where things truly stand right now in the country going into November? What races are you saying, wow, if this happens, then all bets are off? Or if this happens, yep, that's where we're going. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
I'd watch the two runoffs in Texas. Now, unlike most runoffs in Texas, it's not 30 days later. It was 72 days after the original race. So it's not till May the 24th. So watch the Henry Cuellar, Jessica Cisneros, and then just down the river, the Ruben Ramirez, Michelle Viejo race.
And why are those important?
Because you have two women running to the left and embracing a lot of the verbiage on the left. And you have two dudes. Ruben is not near as right, let me be very, very clear, as Henry Cuellar. Henry Cuellar voted with Donald Trump more than any Democratic congressman, and he was a Mexican from the Valley. So I'd lay that at your feet. But just watch to see. If Cuellar pulls this out, odds are that he is in a runoff. That says a lot, right? It just tells you, political operatives like me, I'm going to dig into the numbers, but it tells you a lot about, this is a man who got investigated by the FBI. They raided his house. It was on TV every day. And if he still pulls this thing out, it just is a lot of lessons for people to learn. You can blame Jessica, you can blame outside groups, but whatever, the results are the results. Same thing in the runoff just down the river in Texas 15, Ruben Ramirez, Army vet, community organizer, small business owner, Michelle Viejo. Whoever wins that, it'll tell you a lot. And if you have the two dudes winning, or the two women at the same time, it does show a pattern. So that's just something I'm watching. The second race is in June. It's the primary in Colorado 8, a new district. It's been drawn just north of Denver. That's almost 40% Latino, because that's where the growth has been. Nonpartisan commission. They drew a district right where all the growth was. It's out by the airport in Adams County and Commerce up there. Chaz Tedesco against Yadira. I forgot Yadira's last name. She's a state rep, but that will say a lot, because again, you have her running with the Emily's List backing and a couple white congresswomen, his backing from some Latino members of the caucus and labor. He's putting together the old coalition of veterans and labor at the Democratic Party. So just watching how that dynamic shakes out is big. And then I would lay the primary in the Senate race in Pennsylvania. You have John Fetterman. You have a lot of other folks running up. The Connor Lamb is a veteran running. There's a lot of good candidates, and people are and don't sleep on this. In Pennsylvania, there is a ton, TON, of Puerto Ricans who have moved to Eastern Pennsylvania, and they're in Allentown, Easton, Bethlehem, North Philly, that are having a real impact on statewide elections. And this Democrat hates to admit it, they overperformed for Donald Trump than they did for Joe Biden by almost 6 points.
Wow.
And that's a pattern. It wasn't as big as the Valley. It wasn't as big as, and it was just, 4 or 5 points in some places, but that's a worry when you have this growing population. So there's 3 places I'm really watching.
Mike, what about you?
That was really good stuff. Colorado H2, I'm really interested in that one, as Chuck mentioned. And what I'm looking for there in the primary is turnout, because I think with, it's probably going to be one of the most competitive seats in the country with the kind of numbers that we're talking about. And turnout, I think, will be a really, really important metric to be looking at. You don't need massive turnout in the primary in the Colorado 8 race, but you need it to be at least competitive. If it's higher than the average number with Hispanic turnout, then I think that's a very, very good sign. If it's at least in striking distance, it's I think going to be as competitive as it would be. If it's far lower, I think could be a wipeout for Democrats. At least in those 5, 6 really competitive House seats. I'm also a huge believer that the 2 or 3 most important counties in America are Gwinnett and DeKalb County in Georgia. You watch for reg numbers there, watch how those numbers swing in Georgia, and Maricopa County. It's such a big county in Arizona. It's almost kind of, not to say it's not fair to say it's an indicator because it's so overwhelming, but there really needs to be Democrats investing in voter registration if they're going to be safe in Arizona in a midterm cycle. So if there isn't any voter registration activity and Democratic numbers aren't moving up, huge malpractice issue, but watch Gwinnett, DeKalb, and Maricopa counties. Those are the 3 big indicators for me in the country.
That's good stuff, as always, guys. Chuck, last episode, we talked about the award that you won, and you closed the discussion with one of your favorite songs, Hooked on a Feeling. And I looked at that quote and I thought, that's bullshit. I know that that's not one of your favorite songs. I was thinking Slayer or Motorhead or something, or at least some country singer in Texas, not Hooked on a Feeling. What's the real answer to that question? You're on mute, I believe.
I knew not anybody would know some of the early George Strait music that I grew up on in the honky tonks of East Texas. Most of my friends back home knew that I had working in that factory was just one of my jobs. On the weekends, this will not surprise Mike. So actually, I can't believe I'm telling people this, but on the weekends, I bounced in a bar because I was a big old boy back then. I was over 300 pounds. I was an offensive lineman in high school. So I bounced and I need to make extra money because I was a young father. We've talked about it, right? So listening to those old George Strait songs, not the recent, but the Amarillo by Morning, right? Those kind of old songs, right? But the reason that I put that song on the thing about what motivated you with that Hooked on a Feeling is my mama was just 15 years older than me. So I grew up on 70s Motown, and that song, hookah chaka, hookah, hookah, hookah chaka, hookah, hookah, hookah.
Such a great song.
Oh man, and when he's hooked on a feeling, it just gets me going because I can remember my mama cleaning the house to it, and so that's the reason I put it down.
Mike, I was in your neck of the woods recently. I was in San Francisco and then up into Sonoma County, and then I went through Marin. Up on the Highway 101. And I was thinking about one of my favorite bands from that era that you might not otherwise know, the famous Dead Kennedys. I was a punk guy as a young guy, and
the Dead Kennedys.
And I always think about the Dead Kennedy song Moon Over Marin when I drive up on the 101. And I thought, I wonder if Mike was a fan of those bands back in those days.
I was a little bit, but the Dead Kennedys and some of those, our music scenes in California are very, very regional, and there's a real affinity for our regional bands. You've got the Journeys and the Metallicas, the Dead Kennedys from the San Francisco Bay Area. Going back earlier, you've got the Doors and the Eagles from Southern California. And we listen to them differently. Those songs have more meaning because they are more regional, but they're pretty definitive part of I never would have guessed Dead Kennedys though, Jason. That's pretty cool.
We should have a whole separate segment and just talk about music. Then we can get into my fascinations with the 1970s Linda Ronstadt.
Oh yeah,
little things like that.
Dated Governor Jerry Brown.
That's right. It's a political conversation, gentlemen.
There you go. It brings back. Mike, you didn't mention your song. I want to put you on the spot, but if you're listening to some music and it's been a long week and you have a glass of scotch or something, what are you putting on?
I like a little Coltrane with scotch, but I will tell you recently I have been listening to the Cranberries that song Zombie, and I'll tell you why, because it reminds me of war in Europe, and it just takes me to a place that is both heartbreaking but leaves you feeling optimistic. So that song kind of definitive of the grunge era, but
I'm looking it up on my phone right now. Oh,
it's good stuff. She's from Ireland, right? She passed way too early. She was much younger than she should. I mean, she passed much too early. It was terrible, but her voice was distinctive in that era. And there's even been a couple of remakes of that song. They're good, but nothing like what the original Cranberries did on that stuff.
Yeah, it's powerful. She's yodeling basically in that song, which is it's a beautiful rendition. The lyrics about the war between the Irish and the British. It's a great.
I just finished Belfast, so I'm in all things Ireland right now. So it's great again to be with you guys. Thank you so much for your insight and your time today. We will be back next time on the Latino Vote podcast. Have a great day and a great week. We'll talk to you soon. Thanks.